Okay, so welcome to the Royal Institution. This is, pretty much the closest thing that people like us have to a church. Needless to say, our guest tonight, Richard Dawkins, needs no introduction, but that would render my job obsolete. So it is customary to do one, so here is an introduction. Richard Dawkins is, of course, our preeminent science communicator and one of the world's very best-known public intellectuals. His works, as you will all know, are many classic popular science books, the incredibly popular The Selfish Gene, which is one of only a very small number of popular science books that have sold more than 1 million copies. And you may be aware of that after writing popular science books, he also began writing books about religion, the God Delusion. Came out in 2006. That also sold more than 1 million copies and caused absolutely no controversy whatsoever. And this week sees the publication of the first volume of Richard Dawkins' autobiography, An Appetite for Wonder, which we have here, and as Martin was saying, is available in the foyer after the talk, in which he talks about his family and his upbringing and the motivations for becoming a scientist. A point of note, this first volume ends with the publication of The Selfish Gene. We will be talking for 3/4 of an hour or so in conversation, and then we'll be opening it up for you to ask Richard Dawkins any questions that you like. But perhaps it might be best to frame it around Volume 1, which ends in 1976, and you can all come back in 2 years' time and ask him the rest of the questions that you're thinking about. Anyway, without further ado, I would like to welcome to the platform Richard Dawkins. Or should I call you Clint?
Oh, come on. Okay.
So, Richard Dawkins, as it says on page 1 of your autobiography.
I'll have to read what... Nobody will get the joke unless I...
Well, apparently you are called Clinton Dawkins, in fact, which is a bit of a surprise to me, having read your work all of my life.
Glad to know you, Clint. The friendly passport controller was not to know that British people are sometimes given a family name first, followed by the name their parents wanted them to use. I was always to be Richard, just as my father was always John. Our first name of Clinton was something we forgot about, as our parents had intended. To me, it has been no more than a niggling irritation which I would have been happier without, notwithstanding the serendipitous realization that it gives me the same initials as Charles Robert Darwin. But alas, nobody anticipated the United States Department of Homeland Security. Not content with scanning our shoes and rationing our toothpaste, they decreed that anyone entering America must travel under his first name, exactly as written in his passport. So I had to forego my lifelong identity as Richard and rebrand myself Clinton R. Dawkins when booking tickets to the States. And of course, when filling in those important forms, the ones that require you explicitly to deny that you are entering the USA in order to overthrow the Constitution by force of arms. Sole purpose of visit was the British broadcaster Gilbert Harding's response to that. Nowadays, such levity will see you banged up.
It really will. Please don't do that at all. So I imagine a sort of alternative reality where Clint Dawkins did a number of different things from your career. Let me ask you about the motivation for writing an autobiography, because in our game, writing about our families and people in general is generally what we try to avoid, isn't it?
Yeah, I do feel pretty self-conscious about it, I must say. It's something that my publishers were keen that I should do, and I thought if I'm going to do it, but it's a pity I didn't make it before my father died at the age of 95. It would have been nice to have talked to him about my early life. I did consult my mother, who is still alive at the age of 96, and that was very useful. And I thought finally it was rather useful to do it to do it as long as I was still around. Otherwise,
did you find the process different from writing non-fiction that is scientific?
Yes, of course. It is different, and I did feel there's a sort of self-indulgence about it. I sort of felt a little bit awkward about it. There's quite a lot of science in the book, actually, as well, especially in the second half. I relied almost entirely on memory, plus my mother's written diary and memoirs, which she wrote privately. My working title was A Patchwork of Memories, and so it isn't the sort of autobiography that's massively documented with diaries and letters and things. Somewhat to my relief, because if I'd had lots of diaries, it would have been manageable, I think. So it is filtered through memory.
I found myself reading it and thinking that, the temptation when someone's lived such a rich and interesting life and has such a public profile, one that, if you're me, has had a profound influence on the work that they've done and their career, and that there is a temptation to do some sort of armchair psychology, this particular incident.
Please don't.
Well, I think we shan't do that here. But as someone who's studied evolution and someone who's studied genetics, it's really hard not to look at a big family tree and the family that you describe and think about nature and nurture and the things that you experienced as a young boy in Africa and how they shaped you.
Yes, I put the old family stories in just for a bit of fun, really. I mean, there's some quite amusing stories too far back to have had much genetic connection to me. I mean, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Henry Dawkins, who eloped with the daughter of General Clinton, actually. That's where the Dawkins family rather cheekily stole the name from the general who lost the American War of Independence, and eloped with his daughter, Augusta, by stationing a hansom cab at each of the corners of the square where the general lived. And he was in one of them, and on a word of command, all four of them galloped off in different directions, thereby frustrating pursuit. So stories like that, which have nothing to do with me, of course, but nevertheless, sort of, I thought, were quite funny to put in.
There are a lot of nuggets. There are a lot of brilliant stories like that dotting throughout the book. But you mentioned that there is a family tree in the first in the frontispiece, and you talk about a family which has a great history. It is a big, successful old family. Did you feel as a youngster? Did you feel that being part of that pedigree was part of your shaping?
I didn't know much about it, actually. I mean, the more recent members of my family had all been colonial servants, sort of khaki shorts and solar topi, sun helmet types. And so I was familiar with that. I mean, I knew that my paternal grandfather, and my various other ancestors had all had that British Empire history, as had my father and his three brothers.
Tell us about your upbringing in Africa, which many people won't be aware of.
My father's job was as a colonial agricultural servant in what was then Nyasaland, now Malawi. And, but it was during the war, and he was called up to join the army. And he joined the King's African Rifles, and so he was sent to Kenya, as it was called then. And that's where I was born. I was conceived in Nyasaland just before my parents left. When all the young men from Nyasaland were sent north to Kenya, their wives were strictly told to stay behind. They were not allowed to accompany them. My mother disobeyed all orders, and they smuggled her in, and they had a rather adventurous journey in a car, which was a real old banger. It hardly went. It had to be pushed in order to get it to start.
And it had a name as well, didn't it?
Lucy Lockett, I think.
I thought we were the only family who named their cars, but I was pleased to read that.
Yes. And they kept a diary of this journey, and it was obviously quite an adventure. And they so my mother was the only one of these colonial wives who got in, and that's where I was born. I was born in Nairobi, and spent my first 2 years there. And my mother was pretty much sort of camp following. my father was away in the Abyssinian campaign, the Somali campaign. And so she was sort of following the various places where he was posted. And my earliest memories are from there, but I'd left when I was 2, so and we went back to Nyasaland then. And I've got much more memories from there, of course.
You speak with great affection about your father, and you've just mentioned that you'd wished you'd written this before he died.
Yes.
How significant in terms of your personality, your character, do you think?
Well, he read botany at Oxford, so he was a biologist too. He was much more of a naturalist than I have been, and he knew the names of all the wildflowers and things. And I think my grandfather, his father, was rather shocked when he discovered that I couldn't name. I think it was a blue tit on the bird table, and I thought it was a chaffinch, and he was absolutely scandalized. That was equivalent to not having heard of Shakespeare in the Dawkins family. They're a little bit unfair because I only just arrived from Africa, and they don't have either chaffinches or blue tits in Nyasaland. But I wasn't much of a naturalist, and my father was. But I did, probably through his influence, follow him into the biological stream at school, and didn't do very well at school, but that did set me into the biological stream. And then when I got to Oxford, then I became really enthusiastic about biology.
So when did the appetite for wonder, as the book is called, when did that begin?
Not really until my second year at Oxford, and I think it was the tutorial system which probably fired me up.
Well, let's come on to that in just a minute before
Yes.
we get out of Africa, which is an apposite phrase, really, out of Africa. Did you have any sense growing up in Kenya that you were in the cradle of humanity?
Alas, no. I mean, I had no idea. I don't think that was really known at the time, was it? Because I don't think the
leakies were out there.
Yes, I mean, but the South African fossils were earlier than that.
Like the town child.
Yes. No, I had absolutely no idea.
What about amongst your family? I mean, your father was a biologist.
I don't think that was ever talked about, to my regret.
Have you been back since?
Oh, yes. I went back, and Lala, my wife, and I went back one Christmas to stay with the Leakey family, with the Richard Leakey family, in their house, a sort of beach house at Lamu on the Indian Ocean coast, and had a wonderful time. And Maeve Leakey, Richard's wife, who's another distinguished paleontologist, took us to the Nairobi Museum and showed us these sacred relics. I mean, you know, Deer Boy and the Turkana Boy, 1470, all these legendary fossils. We weren't allowed to touch the real thing. We could pick up the replicas that were stored beside the real thing, but the real things are treated like holy saints' relics. And I must say, you do get a feeling, a sort of, I mean, I was almost in tears seeing these extraordinary fossils.
But not whilst you were growing up there?
No, not at all, I'm afraid. No.
Unaware. And in terms of this, you describe it as idyllic. It does sound kind of idyllic growing up in Africa, in the wilds. Now, without going into the sort of armchair psychology of it, being outside, being in the natural environment, having a biologist as a father, was that contributing? Was that a trigger for biology later, or
it's hard to say. Not in any obvious sense. I mean, I think, as I said, I sort of drifted into the biology stream at school, really not through any, alas, at that time, not through any great inspiration or enthusiasm, but just that's what my father had done, and I sort of, you know, I quite liked biology, but it wasn't a major passion until I got to Oxford, I regret to say.
There are a couple of moments in the book where you're quite hard on your 7-year-old self for not being sceptical enough. And there's also a couple of moments when you sort of note that you were sceptical, particularly about correctly identifying that Santa Claus was in fact some chap called Sam.
Yes.
I thought you were quite harsh on yourself for children, in general, not being sceptical.
Yeah, it was kind of downhill all the way after the age of 1 when This story is in my mother's memoir. I don't remember it myself, but there was a man called Sam who dressed up as Santa Claus for the children's party, and the children were all thoroughly taken in, and he was hoing and doing all the right sort of things. And then finally he said, well, it's time for me to go, and he got up and he said I was going to get my reindeer, and left, and all the children said, bye-bye, Santa, and so on. And I looked up and said, Sam's gone. So that was the high spot of my skeptical career. And then, Adam, I think you're then referring, it went downhill after that, because I recounted how up on Zomba Mountain in Nyasaland at the age of about 6, I was playing hide and seek with a very nice African man. And I was looking everywhere for him, and I looked in a particular hut, and he definitely wasn't there. He absolutely wasn't there. So I went on searching. Then I came back to the same hut, and he was there. And he told me that he'd been there all along, but had made himself invisible. And I thought that was a more plausible explanation than that he was lying. So I'm not very proud of that.
I don't see what's wrong with that at all. So that was your African childhood. I know we've summarised it in just 10 minutes, and then all of a sudden you migrate back to England, and your dad gets a call, and then everything changes again.
Yes. In 1946, while we were still in Africa, my father inherited a farm, well, a sort of minor, a sort of junior estate in Oxfordshire at Overnorton, which had been in the Dawkins family since 1723, I think. So we sort of upstaged David Cameron as members of the Chipping Norton set. But it had been in the Dawkins family, and I think my father barely knew of its existence. But he suddenly was left it in the will of an extremely distant cousin, a third cousin called Hereward Dawkins, and didn't really expect it to change his life very much, because his career was in Africa. He was an agriculturalist, but he was a tropical agriculturalist, and the estate was let on a long lease to a woman called Mrs. Daly. Then when we came home to England on leave, Mrs. Daly suddenly died, and so my parents were faced with the choice of whether to take over the farm or whether to return to Africa. And their parents and family lawyers and everything advised them to go straight back to Africa and have nothing to do with the farm. Nobody ever made any money farming and so on. But they decided, against all advice, that they would stay in England. So my father gave up his job in Africa, gave up his pension, and retrained as an English farmer. It hadn't really been run as a farm since 1723. It had been a sort of country estate sort of thing.
What was the crop?
He started a sort of arable plus dairy. He got Jersey cows, and eventually ran a cream business and made a success of it. It was a successful farm, but it completely changed my life and indeed his, because they were going to spend the rest of his career in Africa, and instead we came back to England, and so I had an English upbringing instead of an African one.
And then what is a pretty traditional, old-fashioned public school upbringing. So you were sent to boarding school aged...
Yes, I was first sent to boarding school at the age of 7, which is much too young to go to boarding school, by the way. And then again, that was in Africa. That was in what was then Southern Rhodesia. And then sent to boarding school again in England at the age of 8, and was in boarding school all the time. It was a bit later than the height of the cruelty of English public schools, English boarding schools. It was pretty tough, but it wasn't as bad as in the previous generation. John Betjeman's, many people may have read John Betjeman's wonderful verse autobiography, where he describes the horrors of the boarding school experience. I mean,
but it was a time where you experienced fagging and beating and...
Fagging and beating.
Low-level paedophilia.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, it wasn't pleasant, and it's that kind of school still exists, but it's now a far more pleasant environment now. I mean, it's really, I think, rather a nice.
It is interesting that there's a lot of matter-of-factness about some things which are very anachronistic now. So that beatings and faggings just seems like an alien world nowadays. But you do write about them as these are things that happened. They didn't appear to have any particular influence on your character. You write with great affection for some teachers and some loathing for others. Well,
I wanted to be factual. I mean, I didn't want to write a misery memoir, as I believe they're called. Yes. So I wanted to state the facts rather than kind of wallow in misery.
And what about, so another thing that you've talked about previously, but also in the book explicitly, it's effectively a Christian upbringing. There's that very typical public school Christian background.
Yes.
Chapel, hymns.
Yes, it's very Anglican, and so quite gentle in a way. It wasn't thrust down my throat the way it might have been if it had been a different church than the Anglican Church.
But you write with great affection for hymns, which I don't think is surprising, and it's also my upbringing, in a much more minor public school.
But again, Anglican.
Anglican,
yes.
And there's an interesting generational thing which I've tried on audiences before. In fact, I think you were in the audience once where you simply have to say the words in front of a crowd, possibly of atheists. You simply have to say, "Our Father."
Well,
and they do nothing. No, but having tried that on 16-year-olds in London, they look blank.
Seriously,
absolutely no recognition of what stimulus that.
I don't know whether
is.
To be shocked or elated by that. Slightly shocked because it does suggest a lack of historical.
Well, I think it was the introduction of a much more multicultural religious education in the 80s that meant that we weren't so, because people such as yourself and also me went to chapel 3 times a week and blurted forth these words that, as you describe, you have no real sense of what they mean, if they mean anything, and they become sort of nonsense.
Yes, I mean, I do remember the general confession where you have to say Sunday after Sunday what miserable offenders, miserable sinners you are. And it always struck me that because it was written down to be said not just today, but next Sunday and the Sunday after, you haven't the slightest intention of being anything other than a miserable offender for the rest of your life. And they've been saying that since 1620 or something.
With no evolutionary progression whatsoever.
Yeah.
But you did actually go through a religious period.
As St. Paul said, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. So yes, I went through a religious phase. I was confirmed into the Church of England at the age of probably 13. And saw the light a couple of years later.
It's interesting the way you write about your parents' reaction to that, which was incredibly sort of a Gallic shrug is how it read to me. It sounded like your mum just assumed, oh, well, you'll grow out of it. This is the school's responsibility.
I did have a conversation with her at the age of about 9 where we sort of worked out that because there were lots of different religions, they couldn't all be right. And I got it at that age that there was something arbitrary about the one that I, just by sheer accident, happened to have been brought up in. But then I had a relapse at the age of about 13 and got confirmed, and became really intensely religious at that time. And I used to sort of fantasize that if I went down in the middle of the night into the chapel and prayed hard enough, I might see a vision, or an angel might appear, or something like that.
No luck?
So, I didn't try, to be fair.
That's very good Christian practice there. Well, let's move on from that. And so you've mentioned how then you go up to Oxford, and this was the forming of you? These were the years that really turned you into the adult that you are now. Tell us what happened, Balliol.
Well, yes, I think it took me a while. I think probably the whole of my first year, as it were, thought I was still at school, which is a very different way of going about learning. It's textbook-based, and so you have textbooks in which the knowledge that you're supposed to be absorbing is, and your teachers know what you're supposed to know, and you have to sort of satisfy them that you know it in exams. That's school, and I didn't tumble to the difference between school and university until my second year, where throwaway textbooks, no textbooks. You got sent into the library every week with a reading list of original research literature and an assignment to write an essay on a probably quite narrow subject. But to prepare for writing that essay, you read the most recent research papers on the topic. And at the end of a week, if you do it properly, at the end of a week of doing this, you have become the world authority on that subject, because nobody else has read it up so recently as you have, certainly not your tutor. And that to me was a wonderful experience, because although I was sort of aware that the subjects in which I became for that 1 week a world authority was a very narrow subject, the experience of being an authority that has most recently read up on the subject, the most recent research, Brown and McAllister, 19 whatever it is, you know, and they're disagreeing with Smith and Jones, you get an idea of controversy, you get an idea that it's not just a set of facts that you have to learn. You get an idea that this is active scholarship. And that really inspired me when I got that in my second year. I didn't get it till my second year. And then my essays, they weren't, I don't think they were any good, but they were acts of creation rather than acts of regurgitation.
Give us some biographical information here. So what year did you go up to Oxford?
Oh, I went up in the autumn of 1959 yes, 1959 to 62.
And that was to Balliol, which many of your family members had been to?
Yes, there was a sort of family tradition of going to this particular college, Balliol, and I think it would have broken my grandfather's heart if I hadn't got into Balliol.
And there's a quite interesting description of what the 18-year-old Richard Dawkins was like in terms of, in fact, what all university students were like at Oxford at that time.
Oh, well, yes.
I found quite surprising.
You mean about sort of...
Well, moustaches and tweed jackets. That's right. And pipes.
I think we tried to appear older than we were. And so we tried to look like adults. And so, I didn't grow a moustache, but many of my friends did, and they smoked a pipe, and they wore, I don't know, jackets with leather patches, and it was very different from today, actually. I don't want to characterize what today's students look like, but I don't get the impression that today's students are struggling to look older than they are.
I think that's true, and I took minor issue with that section of the book, because what you described sounded a little bit like Brideshead. So these public schoolboys going up and then adopting a sort of affectation of a gentleman, and then becoming gentlemen, I suppose. But I think that students, they may not dress like that now, but the first years that I teach, God, they think they're adults. Are there any in the audience?
Yes, I mean, the Brideshead comparison's paradoxical because, on the one hand, yes, they would have dressed in the way that I said, but on the other hand, there was Sebastian Flight's teddy bear.
The teddy, yes, of course. Did you have it? You didn't have a teddy.
So no. So he's trying to be younger than he was. A fabulous book, by the way.
When you're at Oxford now, when you see undergraduates now, do you see at Balliol? Is it a different species of undergraduate you see?
I think there is this. I hope I'm not going to be too unpopular for things. I don't think that they're trying to look older than they are. Why should they? I mean, why not be the age you actually are? I mean, in the book, I described the contrast between what you see on the notice board on the first day of a new term, a new year. Freshers welcome. And it says something like, freshers, feeling lonely, missing mum, do drop in for coffee, we love you. That would have been inconceivable when I was a freshman.
But quite kind, though.
Very kind. I mean, it's lovely. But when I was a freshman, the notice board said things like, would the, quote, gentleman who removed my umbrella from the so-and-so, was that a totally different kind of atmosphere?
And what about in your spare time, when you weren't studying? What cultural things were you interested in? There's a lot of poetry in this book. You've got a deep affection.
Yes, I love poetry. And I wasn't really studying it. I learned to love poetry from my father, really. I think it's rather touching. There's an anthology, which my mother still has, of poetry written out by him in handwriting of his favourite, quite a thick binder of his favourite poems, which I read, and many of them have become my favourite poems. I learned recently that they were all written by him, one at a time, as accompanying letters to my mother when they were engaged. And my father was temporarily at Cambridge doing a postgraduate degree in tropical agriculture. And every week he would write to his fiancée, my mother, and enclose a handwritten poem. And she kept them and bound them into this volume, which we still have, and which quite substantially coloured my own taste in poetry.
The transition from undergraduate to research scientist, I think, is always really formative for people who embark on science as a life. What was the process for you when you undergraduate?
Yes, well, I sort of thought I wanted to do a research degree, and I was pretty uncertain what I wanted to do. And my college tutor, the wonderful Peter Brunet, offered me a project in the sort of biochemical end of zoology, which was his field. And I accepted his suggestion and started to read up about it, but I was never really fired up by it. And I happened, in my last but one term, to have tutorials with Nico Tinbergen, who later won the Nobel Prize. And he was the lecturer in animal behavior. And that really inspired me. And so I really, really wanted to work with him. And he seemed to like his tutorials with me. And so when I went to ask him if I could do research with him, he said yes, and I was over the moon about that. And so I joined the animal behavior group at Oxford under Tinbergen. And that was a major turning point in my life.
And what was the actual research that you began? I mean, was it lab-based or?
Yes, it was lab-based. It was really nothing to do with the books that I was later to write. It, in a way, had more in common with experimental psychology. It was a sort of, I don't know how much you want me to go into. I mean,
well, I mean, we actually, you know, we don't have that long, and I think the most interesting work comes after
yes,
this period.
Okay, yeah.
But this working with Tinbergen set you up as a critical thinker, as a scientist, learning the scientific method, learning how to ask scientific questions.
Yes, I mean, the Tinbergen group had wonderful seminar meetings every Friday evening, where I think we all learned about critical argument in science. They lasted 2 hours, and the time just flashed by. And the reason it flashed by was that it wasn't just somebody giving a lecture and then questions at the end. It was constant give and take. Nico Tinbergen himself really wouldn't let the speaker get half a sentence out before interrupting with, "What do you mean by?" Yeah, but what do you mean by? And we all caught that habit, and so it was a constant argument going on. And that's why the time went by so quickly. It was a wonderful atmosphere.
The one thing you write, which I absolutely agree with, which is that not what is the point of lectures as an undergraduate, but the difference between actually learning in close proximity to a tutor in small groups or as individuals is so much more affecting than sitting in a lecture theatre and being told things.
Yes, especially if you take notes. The one thing I always tell students is don't take notes in lectures, and they all do, and I did. I took notes all the time through all lectures, and I don't think I ever once looked at my notes ever again. There was just one lecture where I forgot to bring a pen, and I was extremely shy and gauche, and I was much too shy to ask the young woman sitting next to me if I could borrow a pen. And so I had nothing to take notes with. And that lecture wasn't a particularly good lecture, but I really took it in. It's because I wasn't taking notes all the time. And if only I'd had the sense to throw away my pen for all subsequent lectures, I'd have got a lot more out of them.
Do you feel that the university system has changed to the extent that one-to-one tutorials or small group tutorials are waning?
Yes, I suppose that's true, and I think that is a pity, but of course it's a very extravagant way of teaching. Nevertheless, my own experience of the tutorial system, which I think was, I thought it was wonderful, but I don't think I actually learned from my tutors very much. I did somewhat, but it was rather more the discipline of having to go into the library, read up the research literature, and write an essay. The function of the tutor was just to make sure you did that. I don't think I imbibed much wisdom or knowledge from my tutors.
But what about learning how to argue, learning how to construct an intelligent, elegant?
Yes, I think the practice of writing essays is good for that. And as for lectures, a lecturer who doesn't drone but talks, grasps ideas out of the air and thinks you can, for the audience to watch a lecturer thinking it out and finally finding the word, it's a wonderful way of learning how to be a scholar, I think, is to watch. Many people may remember. Do people remember A.J.P. Taylor's lectures on television, where he had no notes and he would? This was history, and whether he practiced in front of the mirror for hours beforehand, I don't know. But he gave the impression that he was thinking aloud in front of the audience, so that he wasn't just spouting fluently. He was thinking aloud, and the people, I'm sure his students felt the same way. You're watching a scholar in action, and that is a very, it's a riveting experience to watch a lecturer thinking aloud in front of you.
Quite rare, though. And you sure he didn't have an auto cue? No, I'm joking.
Yeah, well, you need courage to do it.
But you also have to have the space the space and the intellect to construct an argument on the fly.
Yes,
as you're going along,
you do.
Which is hard work. I've seen videos of you being stitched up by wicked creationists where you're doing exactly that, and then they've run the whole thing.
Oh, I know the one you're thinking of.
Which is,
yes.
obscene.
Oh, but that was a very particular case where what I was thinking, I wasn't thinking of the next bit of science to say. I was thinking, shall I throw this person out?
Well, you made the wrong decision. Okay, so that's got us up to you being a research scientist, and then you're still in Oxford, but then there is the transition to San Francisco.
I became a very young assistant professor at the University of California in Berkeley, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and this was big change. It's a wonderful university. It was a time of great political unrest, and my first wife, Marion, and I did become very involved in the politics, in the demonstrations against the Vietnam War.
So this is in
1968, yes, 67 to 69. So it was the same time as other things going on, and students in the Paris of 68 and similar things happening here in Britain. So Berkeley was a bit of an epicenter for that kind of thing, and there was tear gas and police with truncheons and guns and things. So it was an interesting experience one about which I have mixed feelings. And we left after only 2 years and came back to Oxford.
I mean, San Francisco was, legend has it, the epicenter of hippiedom.
Yes.
And you were there at the time that it was supposedly happening.
Didn't take any substances at all, and I don't know why not, because it never seemed to be offered. I was. You think of all places to be in that time, and of all times to be there.
Was it? I sometimes quiz my dad on this. How much have we romanticized that period? Being an academic in California, in San Francisco, in the mid-'60s, sounds like the stuff of legend.
Well, yes, there was a lot of it about, and the students many of them were dressed rather oddly.
Well, that's no different from now.
I was in the Berkeley Library once, and in the biology section, and a young man came in dressed like a sort of King Charles I sort of dandy, with a huge great hat with a great big feather and doublet and hose and things. And he had an enormous old leather-bound French tome, beautiful illustrations, beautiful hand-painted illustrations. It was a book on mushrooms, and he approached me in the library bearing this huge dusty volume with these beautiful pictures, and he said, "Can you read French?" So I said, "Well, yes, a bit." "Can you translate it for me?" I got the spores, he said. And he wanted to know how to grow the spores of this magic mushroom, which
So you got very close to the drugs, but still didn't take any.
Yeah.
What were you studying at this point? What was the research in California?
It was that what I've described as sort of experimental psychology. It was sort of very, very briefly, it was using behavior to try to work out what was going on inside the animal's skull. So whereas neurobiologists cut the skull open and look at the brain and stick probes into it and stick electrodes into it, another approach is to treat the animal as a black box. This is pure Popperian science now. You treat the animal as a black box. You come up with a hypothesis, a model of what might be going on inside the animal. Do some algebra to deduce predictions, behavioral predictions, and then test the predictions. And what I was interested in is that the predictions should be mathematically precise. It's not good enough to predict that a quantity X should be greater than a quantity Y. Any fool can do that. I wanted to predict that a quantity X had to be exactly some function of Y. And because that gives a much more convincing evidence for the model. And I won't say what the model was, but the predictions were, I have to say it myself, remarkably successful. I mean, they were very, very precise. So I see it not so much as telling us anything really interesting about what's going on inside a baby chick's head, but rather as an exercise in how it's possible to do black box modeling tested by doing algebra and then doing experimental tests of the predictions.
Now, so I'm very interested in, we've talked about how families, and as geneticists and evolutionary biologists, how families may or may not influence the interaction between nature and nurture. I'm really interested as a sort of lay science historian in the genesis of where people's scientific interest comes from. And it's round about the same time, the publication by Bill Hamilton I think, is the seed of what then becomes the defining period of your life.
Yeah.
But tell us about that. Tell us about how you get from there to the idea of the selfish.
Yes.
Gene.
Well, Bill Hamilton, W.D. Hamilton, was in the early 1960s. He was a graduate student in London, and he produced a couple of papers in 1964, which were revolutionary, pioneering, and have had an enormous influence. But after a tremendous delay, nobody took any notice of them at all for about 10 years, about 10 years, till about 1974. And ever since then, they have been hugely influential. This is the whole idea of kin selection, what Hamilton called inclusive fitness, the idea that natural selection works at the level of the gene, and what follows from that is that you can expect animals to take care not just of their own offspring, which of course is pure Darwinism, but also of other relatives, collateral relatives, sisters, brothers, cousins.
Why was that revolutionary at that time? What was the general consensus, the thinking?
Well, people weren't thinking about it very much. I mean, people were aware that the social insects were an odd case, and in a dim sort of way they had the idea, but Hamilton did the mathematics and produced these seminal papers in 1964. We became aware of them in Oxford rather early because Mike Cullen, who was Nico Tinbergen's number 2, and I think probably the most important mentor in my life, although he wasn't my official supervisor, he was very good at keeping up with the literature, and he gave us an evening seminar on Hamilton's work, and I was immediately fired up by this and read it myself. And then in 1966, Nico Tinbergen went on sabbatical leave and asked me to give the lectures instead of him in his place in animal behavior. And I was rather diffident, but I wanted to include Hamilton's work and make a big thing of it, and I think I, in the end, based 2 lectures on it, which was quite a departure from what Tinbergen himself had done. And I was rather pleased very recently while writing this book to discover my old lecture notes, which I had no idea I still possessed, but I found them. And I found the relevant lecture and was quite astonished, really, to see that the words I'd used in that 1966 lecture might have been straight out of The Selfish Gene, which I wrote 10 years later, and had sort of forgotten the lecture. All the same rhetoric about genes being immortal, you know, leaping from generation to generation, casting aside a succession of mortal bodies. I used the phrase selfish gene in this 1966 lecture, and then there's a facsimile of the page of lecture notes in the book. Gave the same lecture really in Berkeley in California as well, in 1967. And then didn't do anything with it until sort of 10 years later, and wrote The Selfish Gene. And by then, there was a lot more work had been done.
What was it that grabbed you about Hamilton's work on kin selection? Was it the maths?
Well, it was the idea of the gene as the unit of selection. I mean, that it's such a powerful. Hamilton, yes, he did pretty much put it like that, but the gene is immortal. In fact, a publisher once, when I showed him the first couple of chapters of The Selfish Gene, said you shouldn't call it that, you should call it the immortal gene. And perhaps I should have done. Genes are immortal in the sense that the coded information they contain is reproduced, is replicated with almost total fidelity, significantly, not absolutely total fidelity, generation after generation after generation, such that there are genes which are identical to what they were tens of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago in a few cases. So genes are immortal, not the DNA, of course that's not, that turns over in a very short space of time, but the coded information is potentially immortal. And that means that the difference between a successful gene and an unsuccessful gene really matters. It's going to matter for millions of years. So the genes that make it through those millions of years are the ones that are good at it. And good at it means good at building bodies, good at controlling the processes of embryology, to make bodies which have what it takes to preserve those genes and pass them on. And so I use this phrase survival machine. A body, an individual, is a survival machine. And that's by far the most powerful way of interpreting what an individual organism is. An individual organism is a throwaway survival machine for the self-replicating coded information which it contains. And the fate of that coded information is crucially bound up with the fate of the body in which it sits. If the body in which it sits dies before reproducing, then that coded information is not going to go on. the next generation and the next, and potentially for tens of millions of years. So the genes that are in the world today, distributed as they are in bodies of millions of different species, are here today because they were good at what they did in the past. They've come through a literally unbroken line of successful ancestors, where unsuccessful non-ancestors have been littered by the wayside. And so the genes in a swallow or in a kangaroo or in a hedgehog or in a human are all very, very good at making swallows or hedgehogs or kangaroos or humans. They had to be good at it, or they wouldn't have come through the generations today. Now that, I think, is an inspiring vision, and that's what fired me up about the very idea of the selfish gene. When I first read Hamilton, and then when I wrote it down first in my lectures, and then in the selfish gene.
So the idea, the genesis of the idea comes in the mid-60s from Bill Hamilton, and then it sort of lies not ignored, but not really researched further. And then some people like Bob Trivers picks it up.
Yes, I mean, actually, to be fair, I mean, it's inherent in the neo-Darwinian synthesis of the 1930s, actually, in Fisher and Haldane. And Hamilton particularly applied it to the problem of the relationship between kin, but it wasn't only kin that inspired me. It was the very idea of the survival machine of immortal genes, which goes back to the 1930s, I think.
Writing the book itself, it was a popular science book. It was a bestseller. It is one of the biggest selling popular science books ever. How did that transpire? How did you get from the end of the 60s giving this lecture and and to it becoming a
it was
bestseller?
rather different from my research, but I was always interested in it as a teacher, really. And then in the early 70s, I forget which year, it might have been 72 or 73, it was during Grocer Heath's government, and there was a series of strikes, and there was a 3-day week when the power was cut for great chunks of every week. So I couldn't do my lab research, and decided that now was the time to try to put down these thoughts that I'd been in my lectures, put down in a book. And so I started writing this book, and I think I'd done about 2 chapters, maybe just 1 chapter, when the strike ended, the power came back on, rather unfortunately from one point of view, because I then shelved the book. I've just put it in a drawer and forgot about it, and got on with my research. And then went back to it about 3 years later, in 1975, and got a sabbatical leave, and then wrote the book very, very fast. In the meantime, since I'd started the first chapter, new work had come along, work, as you mentioned, by Bob Trivers, applying a sort of economic ideas, bringing in the ideas of economists, opportunity cost, that sort of idea into evolutionary theory. And the game theory of Maynard Smith.
The great Maynard Smith.
Yes, Maynard Smith.
Absolutely crucial.
So in 1975, when I wrote The Selfish Gene, I was able to incorporate these highly relevant ideas of Trivers and Maynard Smith and add them to the ideas of Hamilton. And it all synthesized.
So there you go. The unionization was the direct genesis of the selfish gene. I don't know whether there's a political message in there at all. So you then write this book. Was it immediately successful?
Well,
I tell you, my dad has a first edition, which we still have, with the original Desmond Morris cover on it, which he bought the year
first impression, first printing.
The month it was released.
You might like to look on eBay at what price those are.
We have to sign it first.
It was very widely reviewed. And I don't quite know why, because I was completely unknown. But I'm very grateful that it was widely reviewed and almost universally favourably reviewed, with a couple of very notable exceptions, which were very hostile. But mostly it was very favourably reviewed. It was helped by a television programme on BBC, a Horizon programme called The Selfish Gene. the producer, Peter Jones, got hold of the book and wanted to make a program about it. He invited me to present the program, but I was much too shy to want to go on television at that stage. And I suggested that Maynard Smith should do it, which he did very well. And so there was a program called The Selfish Gene, a Horizon program called The Selfish Gene, in, I think, 1977. And that did give a big boost to sales of the book.
It's the 50th anniversary of Horizon next year, and there will be various re-showings and celebrations involving that. I'm pretty sure that that is going to be in the menu for it. Tell us about the criticism, because I think it's interesting from a scientific point of view.
The two major critics were, well, Richard Lewontin, who is a very distinguished American population geneticist, attacked it for what later became known as adaptationism, attacked it for a sort of Panglossian view that everything is perfect in the natural world, and whatever an animal does, it must have some advantage. I dealt with that criticism, I think, in my second book, The Extended Phenotype, and in a chapter called Constraints on Perfection. The other major criticism was genetic determinism, the idea, which again I didn't hold and don't, that we are the slaves of our genes in an embryological sense. So this was a straight misunderstanding. From an evolutionary point of view, genes are absolutely central for the reason that I just said, that they are potentially immortal, and therefore natural selection should be thought of as working at the level of the gene. Natural selection is the differential survival of genes in gene pools. So that kind of seems to elevate the gene to a position of great importance, but it absolutely does not elevate it to a position of great importance in embryology. It's very important in evolution, but in embryology that would mean that genes determine the way you are in a way that is sort of irrevocable and rather sinister. So if you talk about a gene for aggression, and it's necessary to talk about a gene for aggression or a gene for doing all sorts of things, when talking about evolution, you want to know why it is that a particular characteristic like fighting or mate guarding or incest avoidance, anything like that, anything that animals do, you want to know why it evolves. And so you have to postulate a gene for whatever it is, a gene for X, in order to see how that gene would increase or decrease in the gene pool over generations. But that is misunderstood to be saying that if you have a gene, this mythical gene for being aggressive, you are irrevocably aggressive and nothing can stop you having brawls and fights wherever you meet, wherever you meet anybody else. You can't cure yourself of this terrible genetic propensity to be aggressive. It was nothing to do with the argument. I wasn't talking about that at all. I was talking about the necessity of postulating a gene for X. Otherwise, you can't talk about the evolution of X, because the evolution of X has to come about through natural selection of genes in gene pools for a tendency to do X. But it doesn't mean you irrevocably, inevitably do X. Whether you do X or not may well depend very, very largely on the environment.
It's an incredibly culturally pervasive idea, that, which I think has a long and interesting history. But it is a fun game to go on Google, if you're actually people like us, to go on Google and type in "scientists discover the gene for X." Yeah. And every newspaper, every media outlet does it on a regular basis. Yeah. And I tried, with nothing other than pure vanity, to suggest that this might be known as Rutherford's law.
Yes.
That if a headline says "scientists discover the gene for X," they haven't, because it doesn't exist.
Yes, quite, yeah.
Now, we are a little bit short of time. I want to ask you, before I open it up to the floor, I want to ask you how the selfish gene has survived, how it's borne up over the last 35 years.
Yes.
In terms of the science, it's still a bestseller. You only have to look on Amazon, and it's always in the top 10.
I mean, an awful lot more is now known about genes themselves. An awful lot more is known about genomes. The human genome has been sequenced, the chimpanzee genome has been sequenced, lots of other animal and plant genomes have been sequenced. So a lot is known about genes, a lot is known about how they interact with each other. And that's wonderful and extremely exciting. I mean, really, really rivetingly exciting, the way genetics, actually the whole of biology, has become a branch of information technology. I mean, it's just like computer science. It's not binary, it's quaternary, but apart from that, it just is computer science. And that is fascinating. I don't think it actually changes the fundamental message of the selfish gene at all, because the gene, as in the selfish gene, is the gene as used by George C. Williams, who's another of the sort of 4 major influences on the book. It's the unit that population geneticists study and have always studied, even before DNA was really known about. So when you study pedigrees, when you look at the inheritance of characteristics, you can talk about genes without actually knowing that there's anything to do with DNA. And when you're talking about evolution, natural selection, you're looking at the frequency of genes in gene pools, in butterflies or peas or whatever it might be. And you don't have to know about DNA to do that. You just need to study pedigrees. So although it's very nice to know so much more about what genes actually are, the knowledge of what they actually are hasn't changed the fundamental message that natural selection works at the level of the gene. Natural selection is changes in gene frequencies in gene pools, and therefore individual bodies, individual organisms can be regarded as survival machines for their immortal genes. Embryologically, it's very complicated. Embryologically, genes cooperate with each other in very, very intricate ways to build bodies, and that actually is. I've already sort of put that in the selfish gene. It's all there, and that idea has become more and more substantiated.
I think one of the big revelations of the Human Genome Project, the first sequencing of our total DNA, was how few actual genes we have. So around about 22,000, which is the same number as a family car parts, and also that almost all of our genome is not genes at all. So 3 billion letters of genetic code, of which less than 3% is actually genes. I've spoken to a number of geneticists who are thinking about moving away from the traditional concept of the gene as being a unit of protein encoding information, and to start looking way beyond into the bits of the genome which we used to call junk DNA, but we now know are far from rubbish, but often we don't know what it is they're doing, those, the majority of DNA that we carry. Do those bits fit into the sort of the overall concept of a unit of information, which is what's embodied in the book?
The genome, it's sort of like the hard disk on a computer, which is filled with rubbish and filled with old copies of things that you once wrote and saved and deleted. And when you think you've deleted something from your hard disk, it's still there. All you've done is delete the pointer to it. And there are lots and lots of parts of the genome which are like that, which are old, outdated genes that are no longer being read. There are repetitive bits of DNA which are just simple nonsense, just an 80. So the genome is sort of a mess, but just like computer disks are.
But we are finding bits in what the things that don't directly code for proteins, more and more by looking at whole genomes and surveying more and more people's genomes. We're finding many more bits of things which once looked like nonsense, but we do see they are conserved, that many people have similar bits, and also that we see variations in those non-coding regions which seem to associate with characteristics in humans, particularly we're interested in diseases.
Yes. And they're probably very important. When another striking fact is that we vaunted humans have the same number of genes as other mammals. So I think the way to look at that is, once again, using the computer analogy, something like, a modern desktop computer, a Mac or something, has a toolbox of routines which do all the familiar things, like pulling down menus and resizing menus and those little boxes that you click in and they make a cross and things like that. The reason why Macintosh programs all look alike and the reason why Windows programs all look alike is that they all use the same toolbox repertoire of routines. And so the resizing of a window, no matter whether it's Microsoft Word or Excel or whatever it is, it all uses the same toolbox routine for, and that's the way to think of many of our protein encoding genes. They're a toolbox for embryological technology, and it's the same toolbox for mice and men, but mice and men call those toolbox routines in a different order, and that's what makes the difference between a mouse and a human. They have essentially the same, and that's true of computer programs too. They all use the same toolbox routines, calling them in a different order. And so the sort of high-level controlling genes, which are calling other genes, is where the interesting action is.
Right, I'm going to open it up to the audience now. Do we have wandering mics? Brilliant. So if you thrust your hands up and wait for a mic to come to you, and I'll try and pick you in as democratic order as I can. Gentleman at the very back row was first up, and then this chap in the front row, and then this gentleman here. It's quite difficult to see with the lights.
Yes.
Hello. Fascinating lecture, and I'm fascinated by your work and your lectures. Is there another career that you might have gone into had you not gone into the one you did go into? Was there another branch you might have gone off into? Biological or otherwise?
When I was born in the Escatine nursing home, there was another young Dawkins born, I think the same day. Also, his father was also C. Dawkins, and my mother sometimes jokes that we may have been muddled up. The other C. Dawkins was a missionary, and the boy has become a missionary. I actually met him in Nairobi a couple of years ago. I don't think I'm a changeling. I don't think I could ever have been a missionary. I could have been a computer scientist, I think, and was constantly, even in the career that I have had, was constantly being seduced into the addictive vice of computer programming. So that would be one definite possibility, yes.
Okay, then it was next, this gentleman here.
Professor Dawkins, I'd like to thank you for everything you've done, because you've really inspired me as a student. But my question is, I would love to go into popular science, like yourself or Neil deGrasse Tyson or Carl Sagan. What advice can you give to an 18-year-old student who really knows nothing yet about science as a whole, and how to get into popular science in the future?
Oh dear, I hate that sort of question.
Admitting that you know nothing, that's the first step.
Yes. I think Adam should answer these questions as well. Well, science is beautiful. There's enormous beauty to be found in the real world, studied properly. Physicists know this very well, of course, because beauty sort of rules what they do to such a large extent, but it's true of biology as well. There is... The real world is wonderful. The fact that we evolved creatures at the end of 4 billion years of evolution are capable of doing science, of understanding the process that gave rise to us in the case of biology, is an astounding fact, which I never really fully get used to. So if you choose a career in science, I think you've chosen one of the noblest careers you could have done. I mean, teaching is another one, and you can combine the two. I don't know whether you want to teach science or do research or what, but both of them are wonderful things to do with your life. I wish you good fortune. I mean, science is difficult. It's hard, but worth it. There's enough difficulty in science that you should never be seduced by the vice of languaging it up to try to make it sound more impressive or more difficult than it really is. Let other academic disciplines do that, because they've got less to be difficult about anyway. But science is difficult enough already, so keep it as simple as it could. Einstein said everything should be as simple as possible, but no simpler.
From a practical point of view, do what you love, but do it and do it over and over again, and practice and be the best at it. Because there isn't a single route.
No, that's right.
You know, you're here now after a sort of torturous pathway that started in academia and went via multi-million selling books and then a little dalliance with the church, and which you can talk about the next time you're here. So just be brilliant, I think is the answer.
Thank you so much.
Easy as that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, honestly.
I think this guy was next, and then right behind him.
If you could go back in time and be around when a scientist made an invention or a discovery or published a path-breaking piece of research, which one would it be?
Did everyone hear that? So if you could go back in time and be present at the discovery of a great piece of work, which would it be?
Well, sorry to be boring, but I think it has to be Darwin, doesn't it, really?
Yes.
I mean, it'd be lovely to know why he sat on it for so long, until Wallace almost scooped him, and whether he really didn't realize that it was such a likely thing that somebody else would come along. With hindsight, the idea does seem so astonishingly simple that the surprise is that it didn't occur to somebody 1,000 years earlier, 2,000 years earlier.
You've said that before, and you've said that in using the quotation from Huxley, who said,
"How extremely stupid of me not to have thought of that."
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I've read that and I've quoted it myself, and sometimes I think, yes. It's so, once you explain natural selection, it's such an elegant and brilliant idea, probably the best idea that anyone's ever had. And then you look at the amount of work that Darwin puts into the origin, and the years, he did sit on it for complex reasons, but the years of research before he felt reluctantly that he had to release it. And I think it's slightly, when you say how stupid of me not to have thought of that myself, as Huxley did, it's slightly underplays what a brilliant scientist he was, what a hard work. He didn't pluck it out of nowhere.
No, you have to say that, because the fact is that well, arguably it's one or two other people, but nobody thought of it until the middle of the 19th century. And so it must be hard. But hindsight is a wonderful thing, and it does. I mean, it seems so much easier than many of the great discoveries of physicists, for example.
Well, you get no argument from me there.
Yeah. So I would like to know why he sat on it for so long. He was a lovely man. He was a gentleman, a very kind, honourable man. As was Wallace. I mean, the whole interaction between Darwin and Wallace is a very heartwarming story, because it could have been a very ugly dispute.
So there was one question right behind you. So if you might pass the mic back, and then there were a cluster of hands on this side. So we'll just try and spread it across the room.
Yes. Maybe this isn't quite so easy. I was very interested in your description of the body as a survival machine, and the fact that the genes are the mechanism for fine-tuning this. I just wondered where you view this horrible thing we may have in the brain, which religious people love to refer to as free will. Would you want to separate that activity, free will, from the genes, or would you want to roll them in together? I was thinking of things like free will takes us to the First World War, which nearly wipes out the aristocracy, where all go charging over the top towards the machine guns. I mean, you can't see the genes really controlling that. It's something else,
yes.
Which can be very lethal to the human body. Even to tribes, not just to individuals.
Yes, I would never, ever have suggested that genes are somehow controlling the will in that sort of way. I mean, philosophically, I think any materialist has to be pretty well tempted by the view that free will is an illusion and that what we decide to do, and we really do think we decide to do it, it really does feel like free will, must be determined not by genes, except in a very statistical sense, but determined by the chain of causation, immensely complicated causes in the nervous system, in the environment. I mean, so complicated as to be almost impossible to trace. But I don't think we want to be mystical about free will. It like anything else in the world, it is what we do, what we decide to do, the thoughts that we have, the actions that we take, must be determined, but not at all in an easy way. And the illusion of free will is so powerful that we might just as well have it because we all think we have it, and we all. But you don't have to drag genes in at all because genes are just among the many causal factors which feed in a statistical sense into making us the way we are. But I wouldn't put it any more strongly than that.
Okay, so there was this lady on the second row, and then the gentleman in front of her.
Thank you. You mentioned shyness, your own shyness, a couple of times, and given the very public life you've lived, I was curious to know whether that was something you had to consciously overcome at some point in your life, or whether it just dissipated with time.
Sorry, I didn't catch the key word.
Shyness.
Shyness.
You mentioned in the book that you had a stutter, quite a not insignificant stutter as a
boy.
At
school. Well, yes, as a small boy I had a stutter, and then at school it resurfaced, probably because it was rather a stressful environment. To the point where we had to, when we marked ourselves out of 10 in an exercise, and then we had to sing out the mark that we'd got at the end of the lesson. When I got 10 out of 10, I would say 9, because I couldn't say 10. I go so yes, but when stutters are rather complicated. I mean, I don't really understand what that's about. I vividly remember the trauma of it. It is quite a difficult thing to have. But shyness may be a bit different. I suppose I was very shy as a boy. I was certainly very shy about approaching girls. Yes, I suppose I've got a bit less shy, but not that wasn't supposed to. That wasn't supposed to raise a laugh.
You are married to one of Doctor Who's assistants, which and I think the best one.
Well, you're right there. I mean, yes.
That's because I was 5 when I was watching those.
Yes, I mean that is the definitive Doctor Who, and isn't it? And yeah, okay. Well, never mind.
We don't want to enrage any other groups.
No.
You've already got Christians and creationists against you. Doctor Whovians are much worse than both of them. This gentleman on the front row with a stripy T-shirt.
Hi there. A question about science in film. San Francisco 68. I imagine you saw 2001: A Space Odyssey not too long after it was released. Yeah. I wonder what you thought about what it said about evolution, the God question, and indeed what some of your other favourite films are or were that include science as a major theme.
Right. 2001 one rather sad thing is that it was more optimistic about the progress that would have been made by 2001. I mean, you know, Pan American didn't have spaceships going to Jupiter, and won't have for a very long time. So that was over-optimistic. The sort of theological question you're asking, I suppose the main thing I got from it really was the idea that, I mean, the thing about extraterrestrials coming and firing up our ape ancestors, that's obviously an interesting science fiction idea, but obviously it's not true. But the end sequence where the hero is transported into what I suppose it's meant to be a wormhole or something. I mean, it conveys to me the idea that there's a hell of a lot that we have yet to understand. That we are just infants, we're babes in arms, where the deep problems of the universe are concerned, and I find that a very inspiring thought. It could be wrong. I mean, it could be, but physicists of every generation have sort of thought physics is coming to an end. And maybe this time they'd be right. But I find myself actually more or less equally inspired by the idea that physics really might come to an end and we really might understand everything. And equally inspired by the idea that there's always going to be something more, and it's more and more mysterious. The deep problems are ever more elusive as we make progress towards them.
By the way, there's a live performance of 2001, the score being performed by the Philharmonia next month at the Royal Festival Hall. I went last year, and it was singularly the best concert I've ever been to. Thoroughly recommend that.
Did it have the Richard Strauss?
The whole score performed live in front of the film. It was, and Christina Kubrick introduced it as well, which didn't hurt at all. Sorry about that. This is just a little plug for the Royal Festival Hall there. This gentleman was first, and then this lady on the end. Would you chuck the mic over?
Thank you. You said earlier that when you wrote The Selfish Gene, you were sort of putting down ideas that you had used in your lectures and your teaching. When you started writing the book, what was your initial idea of what the finished product would be, and what audience were you gearing it towards? And did that change during its writing?
Well, when I first started writing it, that was before the injection of the Trivers and Maynard-Smith theories, which fleshed it out a good deal and which inspired me to take it up again. So I suppose it was going to be mostly about natural selection, the gene's-eye view of selection. I certainly was going to talk about kinship and social insects and aggression, but game theory was something that came in later. What was the other part of your question? The audience.
Was there a culture of popular science books at that time? I suppose Jim Watson's slightly fabulous account of the discovery of DNA was a big seller.
Yes, that's a bit different. That's more autobiographical and gossip. And slightly unkind. I mean, he
slightly?
Yeah, okay.
It's wicked.
Yes. There was Desmond Morris, there was Conrad Lawrence, Carl Sagan.
Cosmos was afterwards, I think.
Was it after? Yes. The audience, well, in the preface to The Selfish Gene, I distinguished, I think, 3 possible readers, the student, the professional biologist, and the layperson. And I said that I had all 3 of them in mind. I don't think I'd be too wrong in saying that it actually has succeeded in not only being read by lay people, but actually changing the way professional evolutionary biologists think. It's not that I made any original contribution to that in the sense that it was already inherent in, the synthesis of the 1930s, the Fisher-Haldane-Wright synthesis, and made very much more explicit by Hamilton and others. But I do like to think that people who are actually out there in the field working on lions or giraffes or palm trees or whatever it is, from an evolutionary point of view, now think in terms of maximizing gene survival. That's what their lions are doing. That's what their zebras are doing. And I like to think that the selfish gene might have had something to do with changing the way professional biologists think when they go into the field and actually work on animal behavior.
I think that's undeniable. Now, I think we're just about out of time, but the lady who's got the mic at the moment on the right-hand side.
There's just one last question.
Oh, sorry. There's also one. Have you got the mic there? You will hold yours for just a second. There's one from the gentleman. I can't see. You're behind a light.
Sorry. Most scientists usually stick to the sort of adult side of science, so why did you start writing children's, like, books for children as well?
I have written one book for children, well, let's say young people, 12 and down and up, called The Magic of Reality. Sort of jointly, I mean, Dave McKean did the pictures, which are very, very beautiful pictures, and it's a book about science generally. It's a book about a whole series of questions about science, and each chapter is a question like, what is the sun, or what is a rainbow, or why do we have night and day, why do we have winter and summer? And each chapter begins with myths from around the world in answer to that question, and then is followed by the scientific answer to the question. And I took care to make sure that the myths were drawn from all around the world. And so some are familiar, some are unfamiliar. But that's the only children's book I've written.
Okay, and I think the final question from this lady on the right here.
Advances in medical science can bring a great deal of joy to people whose lives are saved and to their families and friends. But do you think that there's a risk or a concern for the human race as a whole if what it's leading to is the survival of people who previously would have died?
Well, nice to have a nice uncontroversial question.
And cheery.
Yes. This actually is something that bothered W.D. Hamilton himself, and he became quite unpopular for doing so. Well, not unpopular, but controversial. I think that if your misgiving is right, and certainly in theory there's a lot to be said for it, I would not wish to take action to bring medical science to a halt as a result. I think it's worth it. I like living in a world where there are doctors and hospitals, and I wouldn't wish to go back to a sort of law of the jungle in the interests of the future of the race. So you may have a point, but I think it's worth it.
Well, I agree, and I think that's a very positive note to finish on. So wrapping up quickly, I'd like you to join me in thanking Richard Dawkins. Thank you.